In the year 117 AD, the Roman Empire reached its greatest territorial size. It controlled nearly 5 million square kilometers and ruled over an estimated 60 million people. Its borders were guarded, its economy was functioning, and its armies were undefeated. Yet from that very peak, Rome would never expand again. The moment it became too vast to manage was the moment its decline quietly began. How can reaching the height of power become the first step toward collapse? Rome did not begin as an empire. It began as a small settlement along the Tiber River in central Italy, traditionally dated to 753 BC. Archaeology confirms that by the 8th century BC, small communities occupied the hills that would later form the city of Rome. These early settlements were not yet powerful. They were surrounded by stronger neighbors, including the Etruscans to the north and various Latin tribes nearby. What distinguished Rome in these early centuries was not immediate dominance, but adaptability. After a period of kingship, which Roman tradition counts as 7 kings, the monarchy was overthrown around 509 BC. What replaced it was not another ruler, but a republic. This shift is central to understanding the later rise of the Roman Empire, because Rome's imperial system grew out of republican foundations rather than replacing them entirely. The Roman Republic was built on a mixed constitution. Power was divided among elected magistrates, the Senate, and popular assemblies. 2 consuls were elected annually, each with the authority to command armies and administer government, but each capable of vetoing the other. The Senate, composed mainly of aristocratic families known as patricians, advised on policy and controlled finances. Popular assemblies voted on laws and elected officials. This structure was designed to prevent the concentration of power in one individual. The memory of kingship was associated with tyranny, and the Romans were cautious about allowing any one man to dominate the state. This fear of monarchy would later shape reactions to figures like Julius Caesar, but in the early republic it created a political culture centered on competition within rules. Military service was both a duty and a path to prestige. Rome's early expansion across the Italian peninsula was gradual and strategic. Instead of destroying defeated communities outright, Rome often incorporated them through treaties, granting varying degrees of citizenship. Some allies received full citizenship, others partial rights, but most were bound by obligations of military support. This system expanded Rome's manpower without constant rebellion. By the 3rd century BC, Rome controlled most of Italy. Its political institutions remained republican, yet its territory was already larger than that of many contemporary states. The Punic Wars against Carthage in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC transformed Rome further. Victory in these conflicts brought overseas territories in Spain, North Africa, and eventually the Eastern Mediterranean. Governing provinces beyond Italy required new administrative mechanisms. Governors were appointed to oversee distant lands, taxes were collected on a larger scale, and armies remained stationed abroad for longer periods. The Republic, originally designed for a city-state, was now managing a transregional power. This expansion planted structural tensions within the system. Successful generals gained wealth, loyal soldiers, and political influence. Campaigns lasted longer, and soldiers increasingly depended on their commanders rather than on the state for rewards. While Rome had reached dominance in the Mediterranean, the republican system faced pressures it had not been designed to handle. The very methods that made Rome strong, shared citizenship, military obligation, political competition, were being stretched by scale. The Republic had created the foundations of imperial rule long before it formally became an empire. Yet at this stage, Rome still believed it was a republic, governed by laws, magistrates, and tradition. The transformation into an empire would not begin with a declaration, but with internal strain that grew from its own success. As Rome expanded across the Mediterranean, the balance that had once stabilized the Republic began to shift. Conquest brought wealth into the city on a scale earlier generations had not experienced. Silver from Spain, tribute from Greece, and slaves captured in war flowed into Italy. Large estates, known as latifundia, emerged, worked by enslaved laborers taken from defeated territories. Small farmers, who had once formed the backbone of the Roman army, struggled to compete. Many lost their land and moved into the city of Rome, where they depended increasingly on grain distributions and political patronage. This economic transformation created social tension that the republican system was not designed to resolve. Political competition intensified as ambitious leaders sought support not only from the Senate, but also from the urban masses and the army. In the 2nd century BC, reformers such as Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus attempted to address inequality by redistributing public land to poorer citizens. Their efforts were controversial and met fierce resistance from senatorial elites. Both brothers were killed in episodes of political violence, setting a precedent that disputes could be settled by force rather than compromise. This was not yet the end of the Republic, but it marked a turning point. The norms that had restrained rivalry were weakening. Military reforms further altered the relationship between soldiers and the state. In the late 2nd century BC, the general Gaius Marius reorganized recruitment, allowing landless citizens to join the army. Soldiers now looked to their commanders for pay and land grants after service. Loyalty gradually shifted from the Republic itself to individual generals. This structural change would shape the coming civil wars. Lucius Cornelius Sulla demonstrated how dangerous this dynamic had become when he marched his army on Rome in 88 BC, an unprecedented act. He seized power, declared himself dictator, and used proscriptions to eliminate political enemies. Although Sulla eventually resigned, his actions revealed that military force could override republican legality. The Republic survived, but its foundation had been altered. Into this environment stepped Julius Caesar, born in 100 BC into a patrician family with limited wealth but strong political connections. Caesar advanced through the traditional cursus honorum, holding offices such as quaestor and consul, but he combined political skill with military ambition. His conquest of Gaul, between 58 and 50 BC, expanded Roman territory to the Atlantic and brought him immense popularity and a loyal army. Meanwhile, tensions grew between Caesar and the Senate, particularly with Pompey, once his ally. When the Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, he faced a choice that echoed Rome's earlier fear of kingship. In 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon River with his troops, an act that signaled open rebellion. Civil war followed, ending with Caesar's victory. He was declared dictator, first temporarily and then for life. Caesar introduced reforms, reorganized debt, expanded the Senate, and initiated public works projects. Yet his concentration of authority alarmed many senators who believed he intended to end the Republic entirely. On March 15, 44 BC, he was assassinated by a group that claimed to defend Republican liberty. His death did not restore stability. Instead, it triggered another cycle of civil wars. The Republic had been stretched by expansion, strained by inequality, and reshaped by military loyalty to individuals. By the time Caesar fell, the system that once distributed power among institutions could no longer contain the ambitions of those who commanded armies. Rome was still formally a republic, but the path toward empire had become increasingly difficult to reverse. Caesar's assassination did not restore the Republic because the conditions that had destabilized it remained unchanged. Instead, his death created a power vacuum. Competing factions formed almost immediately. Mark Antony, one of Caesar's closest allies, sought to inherit his political position. At the same time, a young man named Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir and great-nephew, arrived in Rome to claim his inheritance. Though only 19 years old, Octavian demonstrated calculated patience. He did not initially possess Caesar's military reputation, but he understood that legitimacy, public support, and control of armed forces would determine Rome's future. A temporary alliance known as the Second Triumvirate formed between Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus in 43 BC. Unlike earlier informal alliances, this arrangement was legally recognized and granted extraordinary powers. The triumvirs initiated proscriptions, targeting political enemies to consolidate control and secure funds. Among those executed was Cicero, a prominent defender of republican traditions. Once again, political violence replaced constitutional process. Civil war followed against the assassins of Caesar, who were defeated at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. Yet unity among the triumvirs did not last. Lepidus was gradually sidelined, and tension grew between Octavian in the west and Antony in the east. Antony's alliance and relationship with Cleopatra VII of Egypt became a focal point of Roman propaganda. Octavian portrayed himself as the defender of Roman values against Eastern influence. In 31 BC, their rivalry culminated in the naval battle of Actium. Octavian's forces emerged victorious. Antony and Cleopatra later died in Egypt, and Octavian stood as the undisputed master of the Roman world. What followed was not an open declaration of monarchy. Octavian understood that Romans still feared kingship. In 27 BC, he formally presented his powers back to the Senate, a gesture that appeared to restore republican governance. In response, the Senate granted him the title Augustus, meaning revered or exalted. He retained control over key provinces containing the majority of Roman legions and held powers that allowed him to influence legislation, command armies, and oversee administration. Outwardly, republican institutions continued to function. Consuls were elected, the Senate convened, and assemblies met. In practice, Augustus held ultimate authority. This system, later called the Principate, preserved the language of the Republic while concentrating power in one individual. Augustus avoided the title of king and referred to himself as princeps, meaning first citizen. His rule brought a period of relative stability known as the Pax Romana. Administrative reforms strengthened tax collection and provincial governance. The army was reorganized into a standing professional force loyal to the emperor rather than competing generals. A treasury for military pensions was established, reducing the likelihood that soldiers would depend on personal commanders for reward. Public works projects improved infrastructure, and Rome itself was transformed architecturally. Augustus famously claimed he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Yet beneath the stability lay a fundamental change. The Republic had not been restored. It had been reshaped into a system centered on imperial authority. Succession remained uncertain, dependent on adoption or political maneuvering rather than clear constitutional law. Rome entered an era in which one person embodied the state. The transition from republic to empire occurred not through a single proclamation, but through gradual adjustment, legal framing, and careful preservation of appearances. By the time Augustus died in AD 14, the Roman Empire existed in all but name. The structures that once distributed power among many had narrowed into a single office. Rome had become an empire while still speaking the language of a republic. When Augustus consolidated power, he did not dismantle the institutions of the republic, he absorbed them. The Senate continued to meet, magistrates were still elected, and Roman law remained the foundation of governance. Yet real authority now flowed through the emperor. Understanding how the Roman Empire functioned requires looking beyond titles to the mechanisms that sustained control across vast territories. At its height, the empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, encompassing diverse languages, cultures, and legal traditions. Governing such an expanse required structure, continuity, and administrative clarity. The emperor stood at the center of this system, holding multiple powers accumulated over time. He possessed imperium maius, supreme military command that overrode other governors, and tribunician power, which allowed him to propose legislation and veto actions. These powers were not new offices, but combinations of republican authorities concentrated in one individual. The emperor also served as chief priest, reinforcing a connection between political authority and religious legitimacy. This blending of roles ensured that loyalty to the emperor was both civic and symbolic. Provinces formed the backbone of imperial administration. After Augustus, provinces were divided into two categories: senatorial and imperial. Senatorial provinces were generally peaceful and governed by proconsuls appointed by the Senate. Imperial provinces, often located along frontiers or containing legions, were under the direct control of the emperor through appointed legates. This distinction ensured that the emperor retained command of the army while allowing the Senate to maintain a visible role. Governors were responsible for tax collection, legal judgments, and maintaining order. Although corruption existed, oversight mechanisms gradually developed, including audits and appeals to the emperor. Roman law provided coherence across regions. It evolved through statutes, senatorial decrees, and imperial edicts. Jurists interpreted legal principles, contributing to a body of law that emphasized contracts, property rights, and citizenship. The extension of citizenship expanded over time. Initially limited to inhabitants of Italy, it gradually included provincial elites, and eventually, in AD 212, under Emperor Caracalla, nearly all free inhabitants of the empire received citizenship. This legal unification strengthened loyalty and simplified administration. Law became a tool not only of justice, but of integration. Communication supported governance. An extensive road network allowed messages and officials to travel efficiently. The cursus publicus, an imperial courier system, facilitated rapid transmission of information. Standardized coinage reinforced economic stability and symbolized imperial authority, often bearing the emperor's image. Urban centers acted as administrative hubs, linking local communities to Rome. Local elites frequently participated in governance, collecting taxes and maintaining civic order. By incorporating provincial leaders, rather than replacing them entirely, Rome reduced resistance and fostered cooperation. The emperor's court functioned as the final point of appeal. Petitions from across the empire could reach him, reinforcing the perception that justice ultimately resided in imperial authority. Over time, a professional bureaucracy expanded, particularly during later centuries. But even in the early empire, the administrative system balanced central oversight with local autonomy. This structure enabled Rome to manage complexity without constant direct intervention. The machinery of power did not rely solely on conquest. It relied on administration, law, and a shared framework that connected distant regions to a central authority. The Republic had provided institutions. The empire reorganized them into a durable hierarchy. Through this system, Rome maintained stability across millions of subjects, at least for a time. Military power formed the visible edge of Roman authority. While administration and law sustained internal cohesion, the army protected borders, enforced order, and symbolized imperial strength. Under Augustus, the Roman military was transformed from the temporary citizen levies of the Republic into a permanent, professional force. At its core were the legions, heavy infantry units typically composed of around 5,000 soldiers. These men enlisted for long terms of service, often 20 years or more, and received regular pay from the state treasury. Upon completion of service, veterans were granted pensions or land. This system reduced reliance on personal loyalty to individual generals and redirected allegiance toward the emperor, who controlled military funding and appointments. By the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the empire maintained roughly 25 to 30 legions, stationed primarily along frontiers rather than within Italy. Each legion was supported by auxiliary units recruited from non-citizen populations across the provinces. These auxiliaries provided cavalry, archers, and specialized troops that complemented the legion's heavy infantry. Service in auxiliary units offered a path to Roman citizenship upon discharge, reinforcing integration across diverse regions. In this way, the army did not merely defend the empire, it functioned as an instrument of social mobility and cultural exchange. Frontier defense evolved according to geography. In northern Britain and along the Rhine and Danube rivers, Rome constructed fortified lines, watchtowers, and walls, including Hadrian's Wall in Britain, built in the 2nd century AD. These structures were not continuous barriers in the modern sense, but controlled zones regulating movement and trade. Along eastern frontiers facing the Parthian Empire, military presence relied more on fortified cities and mobile units capable of responding to threats. The Mediterranean Sea itself, secured by Roman naval patrols, acted as an internal highway, allowing rapid movement of troops between provinces. Discipline and organization distinguished Roman forces. Training was rigorous, emphasizing formation, engineering skills, and logistical coordination. Soldiers constructed roads, bridges, and fortifications, contributing to infrastructure development in conquered regions. Supply systems ensured that legions could operate far from Rome for extended periods. Standardized equipment and command hierarchies reinforced cohesion, yet maintaining such a large standing army required substantial financial resources. Military expenditure represented one of the empire's largest budgetary commitments. Stable taxation and controlled inflation were essential to meet payroll and pensions. Emperors understood that neglecting the army risked instability. Over time, soldiers' loyalty increasingly influenced political outcomes. Although Augustus had sought to prevent military interference in succession, the reality proved more complex. Emperors were often proclaimed by troops, particularly in frontier provinces where legions were concentrated. The army became both protector and potential kingmaker. Even during periods of relative peace known as the Pax Romana, the military presence remained constant. Expansion slowed after the reign of Trajan, whose campaigns in Dacia and the East marked the empire's greatest territorial extent in AD 117. Thereafter, consolidation replaced conquest as the primary objective. The army's role shifted toward defense and deterrence rather than aggressive expansion. Through disciplined structure, recruitment policies, and strategic positioning, the Roman military sustained imperial authority across vast distances. It embodied the practical force behind Rome's administration. Without it, laws and edicts would have lacked enforcement. Yet the same institution that secured the empire also carried the seeds of future political instability, as allegiance to emperors depended on continued confidence and reward. Sustaining administration and maintaining a permanent army required reliable revenue. The Roman Empire did not depend solely on plunder after its early expansion. It relied on structured taxation and economic management. Augustus recognized that financial stability was essential to prevent the cycles of debt and emergency levies that had troubled the late Republic. One of his reforms involved separating the imperial treasury, known as the fiscus, from the older public treasury, the aerarium, traditionally supervised by the Senate. Revenues from imperial provinces flowed directly into the fiscus, giving the emperor control over significant financial resources, particularly those needed to pay the legions. Taxation varied across regions, but generally included land taxes and poll taxes. In agricultural provinces such as Egypt and parts of North Africa, assessments were based on land productivity. Local officials conducted censuses to record property and population, forming the basis for taxation. These censuses were administrative exercises rather than occasional events, reinforcing the empire's systematic oversight. Indirect taxes also existed, including customs duties on goods transported across provincial boundaries. Trade throughout the Mediterranean facilitated revenue collection, and standardized coinage simplified transactions. Roman currency, especially the silver denarius, functioned as a stable medium of exchange for centuries, symbolizing economic cohesion under imperial authority. Provincial elites often played a role in tax collection, working within municipal councils. This arrangement reduced administrative burden on the central government while integrating local leaders into the imperial system. Although tax resistance occurred, particularly in newly conquered territories, widespread rebellion was limited during stable periods because taxation levels were generally predictable rather than arbitrary. Rome's economic model depended heavily on agriculture, supplemented by mining, manufacturing, and long-distance trade. Grain from Egypt fed the population of Rome, while metals from Spain and the Balkans supplied coinage and military equipment. Trade networks extended beyond imperial borders, reaching India and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. The Mediterranean functioned as a commercial corridor connecting provinces efficiently. Infrastructure, especially roads and ports, reduced transport costs, and supported market exchange. Economic integration strengthened imperial stability by tying provincial prosperity to continued peace. However, financial strain emerged when expansion slowed. During earlier centuries, conquest had generated wealth and enslaved labor, offsetting military expenses. Once territorial growth ceased after the early 2nd century, revenue depended primarily on taxation rather than new spoils. Military payroll remained constant, and occasional currency debasement was used to stretch silver reserves. Over time, reducing the precious metal content of coins risked inflation and undermined trust in currency. While severe inflation characterized later centuries, its foundations lay in the growing imbalance between fixed military commitments and limited expansionary income. Emperors faced a delicate balance. Raising taxes too sharply could provoke unrest, but underfunding the army threatened security. Financial management became inseparable from political survival. When economic confidence weakened, loyalty could falter. The empire's fiscal structure had enabled long-term governance across diverse regions, yet it required constant equilibrium between revenue, expenditure, and stability. The machinery of power was therefore not only administrative and military but economic. Law provided order, the army enforced it, and taxation sustained both. As long as these elements remained aligned, the empire functioned effectively. When imbalance appeared, the consequences would ripple across institutions that once seemed secure. By the early 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire had reached a scale unmatched in European history up to that time. Expansion had been gradual, driven not by a single campaign but by generations of calculated conquest and consolidation. From the Punic Wars to the annexation of Egypt under Augustus, Rome absorbed territories step by step. Under the Flavian emperors in the late 1st century, frontier campaigns strengthened control in Britain and along the Rhine and Danube. Yet it was during the reign of Emperor Trajan, from AD 98 to 117, that the empire attained its greatest territorial extent. Trajan was an experienced military commander before becoming emperor. His rule emphasized expansion in ways that differed from his predecessors, who had focused more on consolidation. One of his significant campaigns targeted Dacia, located north of the Danube in present-day Romania. The Dacian Wars, fought in AD 101, 102, and 105, 106, resulted in annexation of the region. Dacia was rich in gold mines, which temporarily strengthened imperial finances. Victory columns and monuments in Rome commemorated these campaigns, including the still-standing Column of Trajan, which visually narrates the conflict in detailed relief. Expansion eastward followed. Trajan launched campaigns against the Parthian Empire, Rome's long-standing rival in the east. By AD 116, Roman forces occupied parts of Mesopotamia and briefly advanced to the Persian Gulf. For a short period, the empire extended further east than ever before. Maps from this moment show Rome encircling the Mediterranean entirely, controlling territories from northern Britain to the deserts of Arabia. It was in AD 117, at the end of Trajan's reign, that the empire reached approximately 5 million square kilometers, governing an estimated population of 60 million people. These figures reflect not only conquest, but administrative integration built over centuries. Roads, provincial capitals, and military garrisons linked distant regions to a central authority. Trade routes flourished under relative security. The Mediterranean, sometimes described as Mare Nostrum, our sea, functioned as an internal waterway connecting provinces efficiently. The empire appeared stable, prosperous, and expansive. Yet expansion carried inherent limits. The further Rome advanced from Italy, the longer its supply lines stretched. Campaigns in Mesopotamia exposed the difficulty of holding distant territories against resilient opponents. Communication delays complicated coordination between frontier commanders and central authorities. Moreover, each new province required garrisons, administrators, and financial oversight. Conquest no longer guaranteed net gain, it imposed long-term commitments. Shortly after Trajan's death in AD 117, his successor Hadrian reassessed these realities. Rather than continuing aggressive expansion, Hadrian withdrew from parts of Mesopotamia, consolidating defensible borders. This decision marked a subtle shift in imperial strategy. The empire had reached its outermost point, and further growth risked overextension. The moment of greatest territorial power coincided with recognition of practical limits. Rome remained dominant, but the emphasis began to move from expansion to preservation. In retrospect, AD 117 represents both culmination and turning point. The empire stood at its largest size, its administration functioning, its military disciplined, its economy interconnected. Yet, from that peak onward, territorial growth would cease. The structure that enabled expansion now faced the challenge of sustaining what had been acquired. The seeds of restraint were planted within success itself. After the death of Trajan in AD 117, the Roman Empire faced a practical question: how to preserve what had been gained. Hadrian, who succeeded Trajan, chose not to continue large-scale expansion. Instead, he traveled extensively across the provinces, inspecting frontiers and reinforcing administrative cohesion. His reign marked a deliberate transition from outward growth to inward consolidation. Withdrawal from recently conquered Mesopotamian territories reduced immediate military strain. Rather than stretching supply lines further east, Hadrian focused on establishing defensible boundaries. This strategic recalibration did not signal weakness. It reflected recognition that maintaining stability across 5 million square kilometers required predictability more than conquest. Physical borders became more defined. In Britain, construction of Hadrian's Wall began around AD 122, extending roughly 73 miles across northern England. The wall was not an impenetrable barrier, but a controlled frontier, equipped with forts and gates to regulate movement and monitor trade. Along the Rhine and Danube rivers, fortifications and watchtowers formed the limes, a network designed to manage rather than completely exclude neighboring populations. These systems reduced the frequency of large-scale invasions, while allowing diplomatic and commercial interaction beyond the frontier. In this phase, Rome invested as much in defense infrastructure as it once had in offensive campaigns. Administration adapted to scale. Provincial governance became more professionalized, with clearer hierarchies and communication channels. Imperial officials oversaw taxation, justice, and local councils. Cities remained central nodes of control, linking rural populations to Roman authority. Urbanization spread Roman culture, language, and law, particularly in the western provinces. Latin inscriptions, amphitheaters, baths, and temples appeared far from Italy, reinforcing shared identity, yet integration was uneven. In the eastern provinces, long-established Greek cities retained cultural autonomy while accepting Roman oversight. The empire managed diversity through accommodation rather than uniformity. Economic maintenance required stable trade networks. Grain shipments from Egypt continued to feed Rome's population, and roads ensured movement of goods across continents. Merchant activity flourished under relative peace, especially during the 2nd century, often associated with the Pax Romana. Stability encouraged investment and urban development. However, equilibrium depended on careful financial management. Military payroll remained constant, even without new conquests, generating additional spoils. Tax revenue needed to cover fixed costs. While the empire functioned effectively during this period, it was operating within structural limits defined by geography, logistics, and economics. Communication delays across vast distances persisted. Decisions made in Rome could take weeks to reach distant governors. Frontier commanders possessed significant discretion, increasing reliance on their loyalty. Succession planning also grew more delicate. Emperors adopted capable heirs to maintain continuity, as seen with the so-called 5 good emperors, including Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. This method provided temporary stability, but it lacked formal constitutional clarity. Managing scale required continuous balance, sufficient military presence to deter threats, administrative efficiency to prevent corruption, and economic stability to sustain expenses. Rome had shifted from an expanding republic to a consolidating empire. The boundaries were firm but not invulnerable, the administration coherent but dependent on strong leadership. At its greatest size, the empire could endure, but only if its internal systems remained synchronized. Preservation had replaced ambition, and sustainability had become the central challenge. At its greatest extent, the Roman Empire appeared secure, yet size introduced rigidity. Expansion had once offered momentum, drawing resources, prestige, and political unity from successive victories. Once territorial growth slowed, the system entered a different phase. Without new lands to annex, revenue depended almost entirely on existing taxation. The empire now had to maintain extensive borders permanently rather than advance them. Each frontier required garrisons, supply routes, and administrative oversight. The cost of standing still became as demanding as the cost of moving forward. Scale magnified every internal weakness. Communication across thousands of kilometers limited the speed of response to crisis. While the cursus publicus enabled official messages to travel efficiently for its time, weeks could pass before instructions reached distant provinces. Governors and military commanders possessed significant autonomy in practice. When central authority was strong, this flexibility allowed adaptation. When leadership faltered, it allowed fragmentation. The larger the empire, the more dependent it became on consistent, competent rulers. Succession remained a structural vulnerability. Adoption of capable heirs had worked during the 2nd century, yet it relied on personal judgment rather than institutional rule. When Marcus Aurelius died in AD 180 and was succeeded by his son Commodus, the principle of merit-based adoption gave way to hereditary succession. This shift did not immediately destroy the empire, but it exposed how fragile continuity could be. In a vast political system centered on one office, instability at the top reverberated outward. Frontier pressure also evolved. Beyond the Rhine and Danube, tribal confederations grew more organized over time. These groups were not constant invaders during the 2nd century, but demographic and political changes beyond imperial borders gradually altered the balance. Rome could defend its boundaries, yet maintaining deterrence required sustained expenditure and vigilance. Campaigns during the reign of Marcus Aurelius against Germanic tribes demonstrated that even in a period of relative prosperity, sudden military demands could strain resources. Disease compounded these pressures. The Antonine Plague, beginning around AD 165, likely introduced from eastern campaigns, spread across the empire. While exact mortality figures remain debated, contemporary sources describe significant population loss. Reduced population meant fewer taxpayers and soldiers, increasing strain on finances and recruitment. In a system dependent on agricultural productivity and manpower, demographic shocks had long-term consequences. Economic integration, once a strength, also amplified disruption. Grain supply interruptions or regional instability could affect distant provinces connected by trade. The empire's interdependence required stability in multiple regions simultaneously. When local disturbances occurred, their effects were not isolated. By the end of the 2nd century, the Roman Empire remained powerful, yet it operated within narrower margins of flexibility. Administrative coherence, military discipline, and economic balance still functioned, but the absence of expansion meant the system could no longer absorb shocks through growth. Instead, resilience depended on efficient management and political stability. The paradox became clearer. The empire's vastness, once a symbol of strength, reduced its adaptability. Its complexity required constant alignment of leadership, resources, and security. When those elements drifted out of balance, the consequences would be harder to contain than in earlier centuries. Rome had reached its outer limits. Sustaining them would demand more than conquest. It would require enduring equilibrium in a world that was gradually changing. At the height of its power, the Roman Empire was not only a network of legions and governors, it was a web of cities. Urban life formed the visible expression of Roman order. From Londinium in Britain to Antioch in Syria, cities shared architectural features that reflected imperial influence. Forums, baths, temples, theatres, and paved streets were not accidental similarities. They were deliberate projections of Roman civic identity. The city of Rome itself, with a population that may have exceeded 1 million at its peak, stood as the model. Aqueducts carried fresh water across long distances into urban centres, supplying fountains, baths, and households. Public baths functioned not merely as places for hygiene, but as centres of social interaction. Markets bustled with trade in grain, olive oil, wine, and manufactured goods. Infrastructure was not decorative, it was practical. Roads connected cities across provinces, facilitating movement of goods, officials, and soldiers. These roads were engineered with durability in mind, layered with stone and carefully drained. Many remained usable for centuries. Ports along the Mediterranean enabled maritime commerce, while river transport complemented overland routes. The empire's internal connectivity allowed distant regions to function as parts of a larger economic system. Grain harvested in Egypt could feed residents in Rome. Spanish silver could circulate in Gaul. This integration depended on peace and predictability, conditions maintained during much of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Urban governance relied on local elites. Municipal councils, often composed of wealthy landowners, oversaw taxation, public works, and legal disputes within their communities. Holding office brought prestige but also financial responsibility, as local leaders were expected to fund public buildings or games. This practice, known as oyagetism, tied status to civic contribution. In return, these elites gained recognition and closer ties to imperial authority. Rome did not attempt to micromanage every town. It incorporated local leadership into its broader structure. Citizenship gradually expanded, offering legal protections and a sense of shared belonging. The extension of citizenship in AD 212 under Caracalla formalized a process already underway, reinforcing common identity across diverse populations. Daily life varied widely depending on class and location. Wealthy families lived in spacious houses, decorated with mosaics and frescoes, while many urban residents occupied insulae, multi-story apartment buildings that could be crowded and vulnerable to fire. Rural populations formed the majority, working agricultural lands that supplied cities. Slavery remained a significant component of the economy. Enslaved individuals performed domestic service, agricultural labor, mining, and skilled trades. Although slavery had existed in earlier Mediterranean societies, Rome's scale of conquest expanded its reach. Despite inequalities, urban centers offered opportunities for social mobility, particularly for freedmen and provincial elites who adopted Roman customs. Cultural life flourished within cities. Amphitheaters hosted spectacles, theaters staged performances, and religious festivals punctuated the calendar. Temples dedicated to Roman gods stood alongside shrines honoring local deities. Over time, new religious movements, including Christianity, spread through urban networks. Infrastructure enabled not only commerce, but ideas. Cities functioned as crossroads of language, law, and belief. The empire's durability during its stable centuries rested partly on this urban framework. Administration, military logistics, and economic exchange depended on functioning cities. The Roman world was sustained not solely by distant frontiers, but by everyday routines in marketplaces, baths, and council halls. Understanding the rise and fall of the Roman Empire requires recognizing that its strength was built as much on aqueducts and roads as on armies and emperors. Beneath the visible structure of cities and monuments lay the economic foundation that sustained the Roman Empire. Agriculture formed the core of this system. The majority of the population lived in rural areas, cultivating grain, olives, grapes, and other crops suited to regional climates. Large estates, particularly in Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain, produced surplus goods for export. These estates often relied on enslaved labor, especially during the earlier imperial centuries when conquest had supplied captives in significant numbers. Smaller farms continued to exist, but economic competition and land consolidation had shifted much production toward larger holdings. Agricultural output was not isolated from urban demand. It fed expanding cities and supplied distant provinces through organized trade routes. Grain shipments from Egypt illustrate the scale of integration. The Nile's predictable flooding made Egypt one of the empire's most reliable sources of wheat. State-supervised transport carried grain across the Mediterranean to supply Rome's population. The annona, or grain distribution system, ensured that many urban residents received subsidized or free grain, reducing the risk of unrest. This arrangement reflected both economic management and political calculation. Stability in the capital depended on secure food supply. Disruptions, whether from piracy, conflict, or poor harvests, could produce tension quickly. Beyond agriculture, mining and manufacturing contributed to imperial wealth. Silver from Spain, gold from Dacia, and copper from various provinces supported coinage and industry. Workshops in cities produced pottery, textiles, tools, and luxury goods. Amphorae discovered across the Mediterranean reveal extensive trade in wine and olive oil. Merchants transported goods by sea whenever possible, as maritime routes were more efficient than overland transport. The Mediterranean functioned as a commercial network, linking provincial economies. Trade extended beyond imperial borders, with Roman coins found in India and evidence of silk arriving from China through intermediary routes. Economic exchange reinforced Rome's central position within broader Eurasian trade systems. Slavery remained deeply embedded in this economy. Enslaved individuals worked in households, fields, mines, and urban workshops. Their labor reduced production costs and increased wealth for slave-owning elites. However, reliance on enslaved labor also limited incentives for technological innovation in some sectors. As expansion slowed and fewer captives entered the system, the labor supply adjusted gradually, with tenant farming and other arrangements becoming more common in later centuries. Social hierarchy shaped economic life. Senators and equestrians controlled significant land and commercial enterprises, while artisans and merchants formed an active middle layer within cities. Freedmen, former slaves who had gained legal freedom, could participate in trade and accumulate wealth, though social stigma persisted. At the base were laborers and enslaved individuals with limited security. Despite disparities, the empire's economy during the 1st and 2nd centuries generally supported urban growth and infrastructure investment. Monetary stability under early emperors facilitated commerce, as coinage retained consistent silver content for extended periods. Economic interdependence strengthened cohesion, but also increased vulnerability. Regions specialized in certain products, making them reliant on trade networks. If conflict or crisis disrupted transport, shortages could follow. The empire's prosperity depended on predictable harvests, secure sea lanes, and effective administration. The economic system was not static. It adapted to demographic shifts and political changes, yet its complexity required balance. Agricultural production, trade, labor systems, and fiscal policy were interconnected. As long as these components aligned, the empire maintained relative stability. When imbalance emerged, economic strain would amplify broader political and military pressures. Cultural cohesion within the Roman Empire did not depend on uniformity, it depended on accommodation. Across its vast territories, languages, customs, and traditions varied widely. Latin dominated in the western provinces, while Greek remained the principal language of the eastern Mediterranean. Rather than eliminate local identities, Rome often incorporated them. Provincial communities were allowed to maintain their own religious practices and civic traditions as long as they did not threaten public order or imperial authority. This flexibility contributed to stability during the empire's most prosperous centuries. Religion played a central role in public life. Traditional Roman belief was polytheistic, centered on a pantheon that included Jupiter, Juno, Mars, and other deities associated with state protection. Religious rituals were tied closely to civic duty. Magistrates performed sacrifices, festivals followed the calendar of the state, and temples stood prominently in urban centers. Observance was less about personal faith and more about maintaining harmony between the community and the divine. The emperor himself gradually became part of this religious framework. While living emperors were not universally worshipped as gods within Italy, the imperial cult developed strongly in the provinces. Temples and altars dedicated to the emperor symbolized loyalty to Rome. Participation in imperial rituals reinforced political unity across diverse populations. At the same time, Rome tolerated a wide range of local religions. In Egypt, traditional worship of Isis continued. In Gaul and Britain, Celtic deities were honored alongside Roman gods. Syncretism, the blending of religious traditions, was common. Deities were often equated across cultures, allowing local populations to interpret Roman gods through familiar frameworks. This approach reduced resistance and fostered gradual cultural integration. Religious pluralism functioned as a tool of governance, demonstrating that loyalty to Rome did not require abandonment of ancestral practices. However, tolerance had limits. Movements perceived as rejecting civic participation could face suspicion. Judaism, with its monotheistic tradition and refusal to engage in imperial cult practices, presented challenges. Periodic tensions resulted in revolts, including the Jewish War of AD 66-73 and the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century. These conflicts demonstrated that religious identity could intersect with political resistance. In the 1st century AD, Christianity emerged within this environment. Initially, a small movement within Judaism, it spread through urban networks across the Mediterranean. Early Christians often refused participation in state rituals, leading to intermittent persecution, though such actions were not constant or empire-wide in the early centuries. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, Christianity's growth would significantly reshape imperial culture, but during the period of relative stability examined here, it remained one belief among many. Cultural life extended beyond religion. Literature, philosophy, and art circulated widely. Roman education emphasized rhetoric and classical texts, reinforcing shared elite culture across provinces. Amphitheaters hosted spectacles, while public readings and debates occurred in urban settings. Infrastructure supported not only economic exchange, but intellectual transmission. The empire's cultural system rested on layered identities: local, provincial, and imperial. A citizen in Gaul could retain regional customs while identifying as Roman under the law. This layered identity strengthened cohesion without requiring uniformity, yet such balance required continued acceptance of imperial authority as legitimate. As long as Rome provided security, infrastructure, and legal stability, cultural diversity could coexist within the imperial framework. When confidence in that framework weakened, shared identity would face strain. The period, often called the Pax Romana, spanning roughly from the reign of Augustus in 27 BC to the late 2nd century AD, is remembered as an era of stability and prosperity. Roads were maintained, trade flourished, cities expanded, and large-scale civil wars were largely absent. For nearly 2 centuries, the empire experienced relative internal peace compared to the turbulence of the late Republic. Yet the term peace requires careful examination. The absence of widespread civil conflict did not mean the absence of violence. Frontier wars continued intermittently, and local revolts occurred. Stability was maintained through constant military readiness and administrative vigilance. The peace was structured, not effortless. During the reigns of emperors such as Augustus, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, governance appeared effective. The so-called 5 good emperors are often cited as examples of capable leadership, particularly because succession during much of this period involved adoption of experienced heirs rather than strict hereditary transfer. This practice provided continuity and reduced abrupt transitions. However, This stability depended heavily on the personal judgment of each ruler. There was no fixed constitutional mechanism guaranteeing competent succession. The imperial system functioned smoothly when strong leadership aligned with institutional structure. It had fewer safeguards when leadership faltered. Economic growth during the Pax Romana rested on interconnected provinces and secure trade routes. Yet prosperity was unevenly distributed. Urban elites benefited disproportionately from commerce and land ownership. Slavery remained widespread, and rural populations often bore heavy tax burdens. Grain distribution in Rome helped prevent unrest in the capital, but social inequality persisted. While large-scale rebellion was rare during much of the 2nd century, tensions simmered beneath visible order. Stability was reinforced through spectacle and public works. Emperors invested in monumental architecture, baths, amphitheaters, and roads. These projects signaled strength and benevolence. Public games and distributions fostered loyalty. The imperial presence was visible and tangible in daily life. Yet such projects required significant expenditure, sustained by taxation and financial discipline. When revenues matched expenses, this system functioned effectively. If fiscal balance weakened, the appearance of stability could mask growing strain. The army remained central even during peace. Legions stationed along frontiers deterred incursions and symbolized imperial authority. Soldiers' loyalty to the emperor was a cornerstone of the system. As long as the military received consistent pay and recognition, political order remained intact. However, this arrangement meant that political legitimacy was tied to continued military satisfaction. A dissatisfied army could elevate a rival claimant. Although such instability did not dominate the early Pax Romana, the structural possibility remained. The reign of Marcus Aurelius illustrates both resilience and vulnerability. His campaigns against Germanic tribes along the Danube demonstrated that frontier threats could intensify even in prosperous times. Simultaneously, the Antonine Plague reduced population and labor supply, challenging economic balance. These pressures did not immediately dismantle the empire, but they revealed how external shocks could test the limits of stability. The Pax Romana was real in the sense that internal civil wars were largely absent and economic networks functioned across vast territories. Yet it was not a static equilibrium. It depended on leadership, fiscal discipline, military cohesion, and demographic stability. Beneath the surface of order lay structural dependencies. The peace endured because multiple systems aligned simultaneously. When one element shifted, the entire balance would become more fragile than it appeared during its height. At the center of the Roman imperial system stood a single office, and yet there was no fixed constitutional rule that clearly defined how one emperor should be replaced by the next. During the early Principate, this ambiguity was manageable because strong rulers shaped succession through adoption or political preparation. Augustus adopted Tiberius. Later emperors such as Nerva adopted Trajan, who in turn was succeeded by Hadrian, and so on through Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius. This pattern created an appearance of merit-based continuity. However, the stability of this method depended entirely on the judgment and goodwill of the reigning emperor. There was no legal framework compelling adoption of the most capable candidate. The system functioned when leaders prioritized competence. It faltered when dynastic instinct or court influence prevailed. The problem became visible after the death of Marcus Aurelius in AD 180. Rather than adopt a proven successor, he allowed his biological son, Commodus, to inherit power. Commodus lacked his father's administrative focus and military discipline. Ancient sources, particularly senatorial writers such as Cassius Dio, portray his reign as erratic and self-indulgent. While some descriptions may reflect elite bias, it is clear that political tension increased during his rule. Confidence among senators weakened, and the emperor's relationship with the army became more central. When Commodus was assassinated in AD 192, the succession crisis that followed exposed the fragility of the imperial system. In AD 193, often called the Year of the Five Emperors, multiple claimants competed for power. The Praetorian Guard, originally established as the emperor's personal bodyguard, played a decisive role. At one point, they effectively auctioned the imperial title to Didius Julianus, who promised financial reward. This event illustrated a structural danger. When military units possessed influence over succession, political legitimacy could become transactional. Ultimately, Septimius Severus secured power by rallying legions from the provinces. His rise demonstrated that control of frontier armies outweighed senatorial approval. The army's loyalty had become the decisive factor in imperial authority. Severus strengthened soldiers' privileges and increased their pay, reinforcing military dependence. While this approach stabilized his own position, it further entrenched the precedent that emperors must secure the army's favor above all else. Succession uncertainty did not always lead to immediate collapse, but it generated recurring instability. Without a predictable mechanism for transfer of power, each emperor's death created potential conflict. Rival generals, ambitious governors, or members of the imperial family could assert claims. Even rumors of dissatisfaction among legions could trigger unrest. The empire's vast scale magnified these risks, as distant armies could proclaim a commander-emperor before central authorities could respond. Political continuity, which had seemed secure during the Pax Romana, now depended increasingly on force rather than consensus. The imperial system's concentration of authority made it efficient during strong reigns but vulnerable during transitions. Succession ambiguity did not destroy the empire in a single moment. Instead, it eroded predictability. Over time, repeated crises weakened trust in institutions that once provided stability. The peace of earlier decades had masked this vulnerability. When leadership faltered, the absence of a clear succession framework transformed individual deaths into systemic threats. As succession became uncertain and emperors relied more heavily on military support, the character of imperial power began to shift. During the early Principate, legitimacy had rested on a careful balance between senatorial cooperation, popular approval, and military loyalty. Over time, that balance tilted. The army's role in elevating and removing emperors grew more visible, and political authority increasingly depended on force rather than institutional consensus. This transformation did not occur suddenly, but through repeated precedents that reshaped expectations. The Praetorian Guard illustrates this change clearly. Originally formed by Augustus as an elite unit to protect the emperor, it was stationed near Rome and commanded significant influence. While intended as a safeguard, proximity to power gave the Guard leverage. Its involvement in imperial succession during the 2nd and early 3rd centuries demonstrated how military backing could determine political outcomes. When emperors rewarded the Guard generously, loyalty followed. When dissatisfaction emerged, intervention became possible. This dynamic reflected a broader pattern across the legions stationed on the frontiers. Frontier armies, distant from Rome yet commanding substantial manpower, possessed the practical means to assert claims on behalf of their generals. As emperors increased soldiers' pay and privileges to secure loyalty, fiscal pressure intensified. Higher military expenditure required either greater taxation or monetary adjustments. The debasement of silver coinage began gradually in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, reducing the precious metal content to stretch resources. While not immediately catastrophic, this policy risked undermining long-term economic confidence. Financial strain and political insecurity reinforced each other. Emperors who feared military revolt prioritized short-term stability over structural reform. Administrative corruption also expanded in certain regions. Provincial governors wielded significant authority, and while many fulfilled their duties effectively, opportunities for exploitation existed. In times of strong central oversight, abuses could be addressed. When central authority weakened, local mismanagement could persist longer. Trust in governance depended not only on laws but on consistent enforcement. If enforcement varied widely across provinces, perceptions of fairness diminished. The concentration of authority in the emperor created efficiency during capable reigns, but fragility during weak ones. Unlike the Republic, where competing offices provided checks and balances, the imperial system offered fewer institutional correctives. When a ruler governed poorly, resistance often took the form of conspiracy or rebellion rather than legal opposition. This pattern increased political volatility. The empire's vast scale amplified consequences. A dissatisfied legion in one province could proclaim a rival emperor, compelling others to choose sides. Civil war became a recurring possibility. Even when conflicts were brief, they disrupted trade, strained finances, and weakened border defenses. Stability required continuous alignment of military loyalty, fiscal health, and administrative integrity. By the early 3rd century, the appearance of enduring peace had faded. The structural vulnerabilities that had existed quietly during the Pax Romana were becoming more pronounced. Authority was increasingly personal rather than institutional. Political survival depended on managing competing interests rather than relying on stable succession norms. The Roman Empire remained powerful, but its internal equilibrium was narrowing. The system that had once blended republican tradition with imperial authority was evolving into a more overtly military-backed monarchy. This shift did not immediately collapse the empire, but it altered its foundation. When future crises emerged, the capacity to absorb them would be tested under more fragile conditions. The structural weaknesses that had accumulated beneath the surface of imperial stability became unmistakable in the 3rd century. The period beginning in AD 235 is often referred to by historians as the crisis of the 3rd century, a time marked by rapid turnover of emperors, civil war, economic instability, and intensified external pressure. The immediate trigger came with the assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander by his own troops. His death signaled more than the removal of one ruler. It revealed that military dissatisfaction could abruptly end an imperial reign. What followed was not a single rebellion but a pattern. Over the next 5 decades, dozens of claimants would be proclaimed emperor by various legions. Many ruled only briefly before being killed in battle or assassinated by their own soldiers. This frequency of leadership change undermined continuity and confidence in governance. Frontier armies played a decisive role. Legions stationed along the Rhine, Danube, and eastern borders possessed both strategic importance and practical power. When they elevated their commanders as emperors, rival provinces often responded with competing claims. Civil wars erupted repeatedly, diverting troops away from border defense. External groups observed these internal conflicts. Germanic confederations crossed the Rhine and Danube with greater frequency, testing weakened defenses. In the east, the Sasanian Empire, which replaced the Parthians in the early 3rd century, pursued aggressive campaigns against Roman territories. The capture of Emperor Valerian by the Sasanian ruler Shapur I in AD 260 marked a symbolic low point. It was the first time a reigning Roman emperor had been taken prisoner by a foreign power. Such events would have been unthinkable during the height of the Pax Romana. Internal fragmentation compounded external threats. During the mid-3rd century, breakaway states briefly formed. The Gallic Empire, centered in Gaul and Britain, and the Palmyrene Empire in the eastern provinces operated semi-independently for years before being reintegrated. These separatist movements did not seek to destroy Roman civilization but to preserve regional stability amid central weakness. Their emergence demonstrated how fragile centralized control had become. Economic strain intensified during this era. Military expenses remained high as emperors competed for loyalty by increasing pay. Coinage was increasingly debased, reducing silver content and contributing to inflation. Trade networks suffered disruption from warfare and insecurity. Population losses from earlier plagues may have reduced agricultural productivity and tax revenue. Urban life continued in many regions, but prosperity narrowed. Administrative efficiency declined when short-lived emperors lacked time to implement consistent policy. The empire did not collapse outright during this period, but it contracted and destabilized. Authority became reactive rather than strategic. Emperors focused on immediate survival, suppressing rivals and defending threatened frontiers. Long-term planning was difficult under constant pressure. The crisis of the 3rd century did not emerge from sudden catastrophe alone. It was the cumulative result of succession instability, military politicization, fiscal imbalance, and demographic strain. The vast empire that had once seemed unshakable now faced simultaneous internal and external challenges. The machinery of power continued to operate, but it did so under severe stress. For the first time since the establishment of the Principate, the survival of the Roman state itself appeared uncertain. Economic instability during the 3rd century did not arise from a single failed harvest or isolated mismanagement. It developed from sustained pressure on a system already strained by military competition and political fragmentation. As emperors rose and fell with increasing speed, each needed immediate loyalty from the troops who had elevated them. One of the most direct methods to secure that loyalty was financial reward. Soldiers' pay was raised repeatedly, and donatives, special cash bonuses were distributed at moments of accession. These payments required revenue that the state struggled to generate through traditional taxation alone. Conquest no longer supplied significant new wealth, and repeated civil wars disrupted agricultural production and trade. To bridge the gap, emperors increasingly altered the coinage itself. The silver denarius, once relatively stable in composition, was gradually debased by reducing its precious metal content and increasing the proportion of base metals. By the mid-3rd century, coins that outwardly resembled earlier currency contained only a fraction of their former silver. This allowed the minting of more coins from limited bullion reserves, temporarily increasing liquidity. However, such measures undermined confidence in currency over time. As merchants recognized the reduced intrinsic value of coins, prices adjusted upward. Inflation became more pronounced, particularly in regions where supply chains had already been disrupted by warfare. Trade networks suffered as insecurity spread across frontier zones. Merchant routes that had functioned efficiently during the Pax Romana became riskier when raids and civil conflict interrupted transport. The Mediterranean remained active, but regional fragmentation weakened coordination. Urban markets continued to operate, yet some cities experienced contraction as commercial predictability declined. Tax collection became more difficult when provincial administrators faced both local unrest and reduced productivity. Agricultural output in certain areas may have declined due to population loss from earlier plagues combined with ongoing instability. When harvests faltered or transport was interrupted, shortages could spread beyond local boundaries because of the empire's economic interdependence. In response to mounting fiscal stress, emperors experimented with reforms, though lasting stabilization would not come until later in the century. Attempts were made to reorganize taxation and standardize administrative oversight, but rapid changes in leadership limited consistent implementation. Economic strain was not uniform across the empire. Some regions remained relatively prosperous, particularly those distant from active conflict. Yet the overall system functioned less smoothly than before. Inflation reduced purchasing power, soldiers demanded higher compensation, and state revenue struggled to keep pace with expenditure. The economic breakdown did not immediately dismantle imperial authority, but it narrowed the margin for error. Financial weakness compounded military vulnerability. Armies required steady pay to maintain discipline, yet the means to provide it eroded confidence in currency. In this environment, political legitimacy depended increasingly on immediate force rather than long-term trust. The crisis revealed that Rome's fiscal foundation, once reinforced by expansion and stable administration, could not indefinitely absorb sustained internal conflict. Economic imbalance deepened the broader instability of the 3rd century, turning political turbulence into systemic strain. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire faced not only economic instability, but territorial fragmentation. The repeated elevation and fall of emperors weakened central authority to the point that some regions began to govern themselves in practice. even if they still claimed loyalty to Rome in principle. This fragmentation did not initially arise from ideological separation. Rather, it reflected local attempts to preserve order when communication with the center became unreliable. One of the most significant examples was the Gallic Empire, which emerged around AD 260 under the leadership of Postumus. Centered in Gaul and including Britain and parts of Hispania, this breakaway regime established its own administrative structure and coinage. Postumus and his successors did not reject Roman identity. They maintained Roman titles and institutions within their territory. However, they operated independently from the emperor recognized in Italy. The existence of a parallel Roman authority revealed how fragile unity had become. In the eastern provinces, a similar pattern developed under the city of Palmyra. After the capture of Emperor Valerian by the Sasanian ruler Shapur I, eastern defense required decisive local leadership. Odaenathus of Palmyra initially acted as a loyal ally of Rome, pushing back against Sasanian advances. Following his death, his widow Zenobia assumed authority and expanded control across Syria, Egypt, and parts of Asia Minor. For a brief period, the Palmyrene Empire functioned autonomously, issuing coinage and asserting political independence, while still invoking Roman legitimacy. Like the Gallic regime, it represented regional stabilization amid imperial weakness rather than outright rejection of Roman civilization. These breakaway states exposed the limits of centralized governance during crisis. Frontier defense required immediate action, yet civil wars and rapid succession prevented consistent direction from Rome. Provincial leaders who possessed military resources stepped into the vacuum. The empire had become so vast that when coordination failed, local power centers could sustain themselves for years. Meanwhile, external threats intensified. Germanic groups, including the Goths, launched incursions across the Danube and even into the Balkans and Greece. In the east, Sasanian campaigns continued to challenge Roman control. With legions divided among rival claimants to the throne, border defenses were inconsistent. The empire's size, once a source of strength, complicated coordinated response. Military fragmentation created a cycle. Regional commanders required autonomy to defend their territories, yet autonomy risked permanent separation. The turning point began with Emperor Aurelian, who reigned from AD 270 to 275. Through a series of campaigns, he reconquered the Gallic and Palmyrene territories, restoring formal unity to the empire. His efforts demonstrated that recovery was possible. However, the need for such reconquest underscored how close the empire had come to disintegration. The crisis of the 3rd century did not end immediately with Aurelian, but his actions marked a transition from fragmentation toward reform. By this stage, the Roman Empire had endured sustained political turnover, economic destabilization, military overextension, and temporary territorial division. Survival itself had become uncertain. The imperial system, designed for stability under a single ruler, had been tested repeatedly. The fact that it persisted suggested resilience, yet its structure would not remain unchanged. To prevent recurrence of such instability, deeper reforms would soon reshape the nature of imperial rule. When Diocletian came to power in AD 284, the Roman Empire had survived decades of instability, but survival alone was no longer sufficient. The crisis of the 3rd century had revealed that the earlier imperial model, centered on one ruler, supported by loosely coordinated provinces, was too vulnerable to internal revolt and external pressure. Diocletian did not attempt to restore the old system of the Principate. Instead, he reshaped the structure of imperial governance itself. His reforms marked a decisive shift from the relatively understated leadership style of earlier emperors to a more formalized and centralized model, often referred to as the dominate. One of Diocletian's most significant innovations was the establishment of the Tetrarchy around AD 293. Recognizing that a single emperor could not effectively manage threats across such vast territories, he divided authority among 4 rulers. Diocletian and Maximian served as senior emperors, each titled Augustus, while two junior colleagues, Galerius and Constantius, held the rank of Caesar. Each ruler governed a defined geographic region and commanded military forces within it. This arrangement aimed to ensure faster response to frontier crises and to create a clearer system of succession, as Caesars were expected to succeed the Augusti. The Tetrarchy did not divide the empire into separate states. It maintained the principle of unity while decentralizing operational control. Administrative reform accompanied political restructuring. Diocletian increased the number of provinces, making them smaller and easier to manage. These provinces were grouped into larger units called dioceses, overseen by officials known as vicars. This layered hierarchy improved supervision and reduced the concentration of power in any single governor. Civil and military authority were increasingly separated, limiting the likelihood that provincial officials could use combined powers to launch rebellions. The army itself was reorganized, with frontier forces strengthened and mobile field units developed to respond rapidly to incursions. Fiscal reform was equally central. To stabilize revenue, Diocletian restructured taxation, implementing more systematic census procedures to assess land and population. Taxes were often collected in kind, grain, livestock, or goods, rather than exclusively in coin, reducing reliance on unstable currency. An attempt to control inflation culminated in the Edict on Maximum Prices issued in AD 301. This decree set price ceilings on a wide range of goods and services across the empire. While enforcement proved difficult and the edict did not permanently halt inflation, it demonstrated the government's recognition of economic instability as a structural threat. Diocletian also transformed the public image of the emperor. Unlike Augustus, who had presented himself as first citizen, Diocletian adopted more overt ceremonial distance. Court rituals emphasized hierarchy and divine favor. This shift reinforced authority in a time when personal charisma alone could not guarantee obedience. The reforms were comprehensive, addressing military, administrative, fiscal, and symbolic dimensions of rule. They did not restore the earlier world of the Pax Romana, but they created a more rigid and controlled framework designed to prevent recurrence of third-century chaos. The empire that emerged from Diocletian's reforms was more bureaucratic, more centralized in oversight, and more formal in its expression of power. Stability would depend not on tradition alone, but on systemic restructuring. Diocletian's reforms brought temporary stability, but the system of the Tetrarchy depended on cooperation among multiple rulers. When Diocletian voluntarily abdicated in AD 305, an unprecedented act for a Roman emperor, the carefully arranged succession began to unravel. Rivalries emerged among successors, and within a few years civil war returned. Out of this renewed Sangursh rose Constantine, the son of Constantius, one of the original Caesars. In AD 306, after his father's death in Britain, Constantine was proclaimed emperor by his troops. His claim was not immediately recognized by all factions, and for nearly 2 decades he competed with other contenders for control of the empire. The decisive moment came in AD 312, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge near Rome, where Constantine defeated his rival Maxentius. Ancient sources, particularly the Christian writer Eusebius, later associated this victory with Constantine's reported vision of a Christian symbol before battle. While the precise details of the event remain debated by historians, it is clear that Constantine increasingly favored Christianity after securing power. In AD 313, Constantine and Licinius issued what is commonly called the Edict of Milan, granting religious toleration to Christians and restoring confiscated property. This policy did not immediately make Christianity the state religion, but it ended systematic persecution and allowed the faith to expand openly. Constantine's support for Christianity marked a significant cultural shift within the empire. He sponsored church construction, including the Lateran Basilica in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He also convened the Council of Nicaea in AD 325 to address theological disputes within the Christian community, demonstrating imperial involvement in religious affairs. This new relationship between emperor and church reshaped the ideological foundation of imperial authority. While earlier emperors had relied on traditional pagan rituals and the imperial cult to reinforce unity, Constantine integrated Christian leadership into the state's framework. Political restructuring accompanied religious transformation. After defeating Licinius in AD 324, Constantine became sole ruler of the empire, effectively ending the Tetrarchy. Although he retained many of Diocletian's administrative reforms, he re-centralized authority under a single emperor. One of his most lasting decisions was the establishment of a new imperial capital at Byzantium, refounded as Constantinople in AD 330. Strategically located between Europe and Asia, Constantinople provided access to key trade routes and stronger defensive positioning than Rome. The shift signaled a gradual reorientation of imperial focus toward the eastern provinces, which were economically stronger and less exposed to certain frontier pressures than parts of the West. Constantine continued to develop the bureaucratic state, expanding the administrative apparatus and refining military organization. The separation between civil and military offices persisted, limiting provincial autonomy in matters of armed force. Coinage reform introduced the solidus, a stable gold coin that would remain influential for centuries, helping to restore confidence in imperial currency after the inflationary crises of the 3rd century. By the time of Constantine's death in AD 337, the Roman Empire had been reshaped both structurally and culturally. Christianity had gained imperial patronage, a new capital had been established, and centralized authority had been reaffirmed. The empire survived, but it was no longer the same political entity that Augustus had founded. It had evolved into a more bureaucratic, more overtly monarchic, and increasingly Christian state, laying foundations that would shape its later trajectory. Although Constantine restored unity under a single ruler, the structural changes introduced during and after his reign made long-term division increasingly likely. The empire had grown too large, too complex, and too regionally distinct to be governed easily from one center without delegation. After Constantine's death in AD 337, his sons divided authority among themselves, ruling different territories. This pattern of shared or partitioned rule was not entirely new, but it became more regular in the 4th century. Administrative practicality encouraged regional governance. Cultural and economic differences between the eastern and western provinces also deepened over time. The eastern Mediterranean, with its long-established urban centers such as Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople, remained economically vibrant. Trade networks were dense, tax revenue relatively strong, and cities comparatively resilient. Greek language and intellectual traditions dominated public life. In contrast, many Western provinces were less urbanized and more exposed to frontier pressures along the Rhine and Danube. Latin remained the administrative language, but economic resources were more unevenly distributed. These differences did not initially produce hostility. Both halves still recognized a single Roman state. However, the balance of strength gradually shifted eastward. Military demands reinforced this divergence. The eastern frontier faced persistent tension with the Sasanian Empire, requiring strong defensive organization but benefiting from clearer geographic boundaries. In the west, migratory movements of various Germanic groups intensified during the late 4th century. The crossing of the Danube by Gothic groups in AD 376, partly driven by pressure from the Huns, marked a turning point. When Roman authorities mishandled their settlement, tensions escalated into conflict. The Battle of Adrianople in AD 378 resulted in a devastating Roman defeat and the death of Emperor Valens. This event demonstrated that even reformed imperial armies could be overwhelmed under unfavorable conditions. In AD 395, after the death of Emperor Theodosius I, the empire was permanently divided between his sons Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. Unlike earlier temporary arrangements, this division endured. Each half maintained its own court, administration, and military command. Although they continued to acknowledge shared Roman identity, practical coordination diminished. Constantinople, strategically positioned and economically robust, developed into a durable imperial center. Rome itself, though symbolically significant, no longer functioned as the political heart of the Western Empire. Structural imbalance became more pronounced in the decades that followed. The Eastern Empire retained greater fiscal stability and urban infrastructure, enabling it to respond more effectively to crises. The Western Empire struggled with declining tax revenue, ruralization in certain areas, and increased reliance on federate troops, non-Roman groups, settled within imperial territory in exchange for military service. While such arrangements were pragmatic responses to manpower shortages, they reflected shifting dynamics of power. The division of the empire was not the cause of decline in itself. Rather, it formalized existing disparities. What had once been a unified administrative system adapted for scale now functioned as two interdependent yet distinct entities. The eastern half would endure for centuries, evolving into what historians call the Byzantine Empire. The western half faced mounting challenges that would test its capacity to sustain Roman authority under changing conditions. By the late 4th century, the Western Roman Empire faced pressures that were both external and internal, yet these pressures did not produce immediate collapse. The weakening was gradual, unfolding across decades rather than in a single catastrophic moment. After the permanent division in AD 395, the Western Court, first based in Milan and later in Ravenna, governed territories that were increasingly difficult to defend. Unlike the eastern provinces, which retained dense urban networks and comparatively stable revenue, the West depended heavily on agricultural taxation from regions that were exposed to frontier incursions. When border security faltered, fiscal capacity diminished accordingly. The Rhine frontier, long a defensive boundary, experienced mounting strain. In AD 406, groups including Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed the frozen Rhine into Roman territory. This crossing was not the beginning of barbarian presence in the empire. Many groups had already been settled as federates, but it marked a significant breach in frontier defense. Roman authorities attempted to manage these movements through negotiation and military response, yet internal political instability limited coordinated action. Rival claimants to the Western throne diverted troops from frontier defense to civil conflict. Each usurpation weakened the state's ability to respond consistently. Military organization in the West had evolved to rely increasingly on federate forces. These were non-Roman groups settled within imperial borders under agreements that required them to provide military service. Such arrangements were practical responses to manpower shortages and recruitment challenges. However, federate leaders retained significant autonomy, and their loyalty depended on continued negotiation and reward. When agreements broke down or payments faltered, conflict could follow. The balance between cooperation and control became delicate. The Visigoths provide a clear example. After their victory at Adrianople in AD 378, they were settled within imperial territory as federates. Over time, tensions with the Western court escalated. In AD 410, under the leadership of Alaric, the Visigoths sacked Rome. The city had not been the administrative capital for decades, yet its symbolic importance remained immense. The sack did not destroy the empire, but it demonstrated that even the ancient heart of Roman civilization was no longer invulnerable. Economic contraction accompanied military challenges. Some urban centers in the West declined in population and commercial activity. Long-distance trade persisted, but at reduced intensity in certain regions. Tax collection became more difficult when territories slipped from direct control. Britain, for example, saw the withdrawal of Roman administrative and military presence in the early 5th century. As central authority weakened, local leaders assumed responsibility for defense and governance. The imperial government did not formally abandon these territories at once. Rather, effective control diminished gradually. The Western emperors themselves often wielded limited independent power. Strong generals, such as Stilicho in the early 5th century, exercised considerable influence behind the throne. When such figures were removed or assassinated, political coherence suffered. Authority became increasingly fragmented, even while imperial titles remained intact. The Western Roman Empire in this period was not a collapsed state but a contracting one. It retained institutions, law, and identity, yet its capacity to enforce authority across all provinces steadily eroded. The weakening was cumulative, shaped by demographic shifts, fiscal strain, military dependence on federates, and repeated political disruption. What had once been a vast, unified structure now required constant negotiation to maintain its borders and cohesion. By the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire still possessed emperors, courts, and administrative offices, yet effective power increasingly rested elsewhere. Military commanders of both Roman and non-Roman origin became the decisive figures in political life. The pattern had precedent in earlier centuries, but in the weakened Western state, it grew more pronounced. Emperors, often young or politically isolated, depended on strong generals to defend frontiers and manage internal conflict. These generals commanded federate troops as well as remnants of regular Roman forces, giving them leverage that could exceed imperial authority. One of the most influential figures was Stilicho, a general of mixed Roman and Vandal heritage, who served as Magister Militum under Emperor Honorius. Stilicho coordinated defense against Gothic incursions and attempted to stabilize the western provinces. However, court rivalries and suspicion led to his execution in AD 408. His removal destabilized military leadership at a critical moment. Without consistent command, negotiations with Gothic groups deteriorated, contributing to the sack of Rome 2 years later. Stilicho's fate revealed how fragile cooperation between emperor and general had become. The Western court in Ravenna often relied on such military strongmen while simultaneously fearing their influence. This dynamic repeated throughout the century. Another prominent general, Aetius, played a central role in defending Gaul against various incursions, including the campaign against Attila the Hun in AD 451. Aetius's authority derived from his military command and his ability to coordinate alliances among Roman and Federate forces. His success temporarily preserved Western territory. Yet in AD 454, Emperor Valentinian III personally killed Aetius, reportedly out of concern for his power. The assassination removed one of the last effective defenders of the Western state. Within a year, Valentinian himself was killed. Political violence among elites further weakened continuity. As the century progressed, emperors were often appointed and removed by military leaders. The imperial office remained symbolically important, but the capacity to govern independently diminished. In some cases, generals of non-Roman background effectively ruled behind the throne. Ricimer, of Suebi and Visigothic descent, influenced Western politics for years without claiming the imperial title himself. He installed and removed emperors while controlling military forces. This arrangement preserved the form of Roman government, but hollowed its substance. Authority became fragmented among competing commanders whose primary base of support was the army rather than civil institutions. Dependence on federate troops deepened the transformation. These groups were settled within imperial lands and commanded by their own leaders who negotiated terms of service. While many federate soldiers fought loyally for Roman causes, their allegiance was often to their own commanders rather than to the emperor. The Western government lacked the financial resources to maintain a fully Roman standing army on the earlier scale. As a result, military autonomy expanded beyond imperial supervision. The shift in power from emperor to general did not represent an immediate overthrow of Roman governance. Instead, it reflected the cumulative erosion of centralized authority. Civil administration persisted, laws were issued, and taxation continued where possible. Yet the emperor's position grew increasingly ceremonial. Decisions of consequence depended on military backing. In a system already strained by economic contraction and territorial loss, this imbalance made coordinated reform more difficult. The Western Roman Empire remained intact in name, but real control was dispersing among figures whose authority derived from force rather than constitutional legitimacy. As the 5th century progressed, the Western Roman Empire did not disappear suddenly. It contracted. Territories that had once been administered through Roman governors and supported by imperial taxation gradually slipped beyond direct control. In many cases, this shift occurred through negotiated settlement rather than outright destruction. Yet the cumulative effect was the same. The Western state governed less land, collected less revenue, and commanded fewer resources with each passing decade. North Africa, once one of the empire's most valuable provinces, illustrates this transformation clearly. The region supplied grain and tax income that supported both the city of Rome and the Western court. In the 430s, the Vandals, under the leadership of Gaiseric, moved from Spain into North Africa. By AD 439, they had captured Carthage, establishing a powerful kingdom that controlled key Mediterranean trade routes. The loss of North Africa dealt a severe blow to Western finances. Without its revenue and grain supply, the Western government struggled to sustain military payroll and administrative functions. Attempts to reconquer the province failed, including a major expedition in AD 468 that ended in costly defeat. The inability to recover North Africa marked a turning point from decline to irreversible contraction. In Gaul and Spain, similar patterns unfolded. Visigothic, Burgundian, and other federate kingdoms expanded their authority within former Roman territories. While these groups often maintained aspects of Roman law and administration, they operated independently of the Western emperor. Britain had already seen the withdrawal of imperial administration earlier in the century, leaving local communities to organize their own defense. The Western government's reach narrowed increasingly to Italy and parts of Gaul. Even within Italy, security depended heavily on federate forces, commanded by leaders whose loyalty was conditional. The symbolic center of Roman identity also shifted. Rome itself, though still revered for its history, had been sacked multiple times during the 5th century, including by the Visigoths in AD 410 and the Vandals in AD 455. These events did not eliminate Roman culture, but they demonstrated that the ancient capital no longer possessed strategic dominance. The administrative court remained in Ravenna, a city chosen for its defensible marshland surroundings rather than its historic prestige. Emperors during these final decades were frequently young and politically dependent. Their authority relied on the backing of military commanders, who negotiated with federate leaders and managed defense with limited means. Fiscal capacity continued to shrink as tax bases eroded. Fewer provinces meant fewer revenues, which in turn limited military recruitment and infrastructure maintenance. The Western state entered a cycle of diminishing resources and growing dependency. By the 470s, the Western Roman Empire had become a reduced polity centered largely on Italy. It retained imperial titles, legal traditions, and administrative offices, yet its ability to project power beyond its immediate territory had nearly vanished. The transformation was gradual, marked by incremental losses rather than decisive annihilation. The empire that had once encircled the Mediterranean was now confined to a fraction of its former expanse. Its institutions still functioned, but within boundaries far narrower than those envisioned at the height of Roman expansion. By the mid-470s, the Western Roman Empire still existed in form, but its substance had narrowed significantly. Emperors were appointed and removed with little long-term stability, often serving at the pleasure of military commanders. In AD 475, a Roman general named Orestes seized control in Italy and placed his young son on the throne as emperor. The boy was given the imperial name Romulus, echoing the legendary founder of Rome, and the additional title Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus. The name carried symbolic weight, linking the last Western ruler to both Rome's mythical beginnings and the first emperor, Augustus. Yet behind the title stood limited authority. Real power remained with Orestes and the federate troops who supported him. These federate forces, composed largely of Germanic soldiers settled within imperial territory, expected land allocations in Italy as compensation for their service. When Orestes refused their demands, tensions escalated. The troops turned to one of their commanders, Odoacer, who led a revolt in AD 476. Orestes was captured and executed, and shortly thereafter, Romulus Augustulus was deposed. Unlike many earlier regime changes, this event did not result in the proclamation of another Western emperor. Instead, Odoacer sent the imperial insignia to the Eastern emperor in Constantinople, Zeno, declaring that the West no longer required a separate emperor. Odoacer ruled Italy with the title of king, formally recognizing the authority of the Eastern court while exercising independent control locally. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus in AD 476 has long been treated as the traditional date marking the fall of the Western Roman Empire. However, the event was less dramatic than the label suggests. There was no large-scale destruction of Rome itself, nor a complete collapse of administrative structures overnight. Roman law continued to operate, taxation persisted in areas still governed, and many institutions remained intact under new leadership. Odoacer maintained aspects of Roman governance, relying on existing administrative frameworks. For contemporaries, the transition may have seemed more like a political adjustment than an abrupt civilizational break. What made AD 476 significant was symbolic and structural rather than immediately catastrophic. For the first time in centuries, no Western emperor reigned in Italy. The imperial office that had once embodied Roman unity in the West ceased to function. Authority consolidated in the Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, which continued to regard itself as the legitimate Roman state. The Eastern Emperor did not attempt to restore a Western counterpart at that moment, acknowledging the changed political landscape. The Western territories had already fragmented into successor kingdoms, Visigothic, Vandal, Burgundian, and others, each governing former Roman provinces. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus formalized a process long underway. It marked the end of imperial continuity in the West, not the disappearance of Roman culture or institutions. Roads, cities, legal traditions, and Christian structures persisted. Yet the centralized Western imperial office, born from Augustus's careful transformation of the Republic, had come to an end. The empire that once stretched across continents no longer existed in unified Western form. Although AD 476 is often presented as the definitive end of the Western Roman Empire, the reality was more complex. The removal of Romulus Augustulus ended the line of Western emperors in Italy, but it did not erase Roman identity, administration, or culture overnight. In many regions, daily life continued with gradual adaptation rather than abrupt collapse. The question is not simply when Rome fell, but what it meant for Rome to fall. Political authority in the West shifted into the hands of successor kingdoms, yet these kingdoms inherited and adapted Roman structures rather than replacing them entirely. Odoacer, who assumed control of Italy after deposing Romulus Augustulus, governed using existing Roman administrative systems. The Senate in Rome continued to function in a limited capacity. Taxation mechanisms persisted where feasible. Roman law remained influential, particularly among Roman populations living under new rulers. Odoacer himself styled his authority carefully, recognizing the Eastern Emperor Zeno while ruling Italy autonomously. This arrangement suggests continuity framed within altered hierarchy rather than a complete institutional vacuum. In the decades following 476, other Germanic rulers followed similar patterns. The Visigoths in Gaul and Spain maintained Roman legal traditions for their Roman subjects while applying their own customary laws to Gothic communities. The Burgundians and Ostrogoths adopted comparable dual systems. When Theodoric the Great established Ostrogothic rule in Italy at the end of the 5th century, he presented himself as a protector of Roman heritage. He preserved the Senate, upheld Roman administrative offices, and commissioned building projects in Ravenna that reflected imperial style. Under his rule, the outward appearance of Roman governance endured even without a Western emperor. Meanwhile, in the East, the Roman Empire continued uninterrupted. Centered in Constantinople, the Eastern state preserved imperial institutions, law, and bureaucracy. Later historians would refer to this polity as the Byzantine Empire, but its rulers considered themselves Roman emperors. The Eastern Empire retained greater economic strength and urban continuity than the West, enabling it to survive challenges that overwhelmed Western provinces. The legal codification under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century further reinforced continuity with earlier Roman law. From this perspective, Rome did not vanish in 476, it persisted in altered form. What changed most profoundly in the West was centralized imperial authority. The Western emperor had symbolized unity across diverse territories. Once that office ceased, regional kingdoms consolidated independent control. Over time, these kingdoms developed distinct political identities, yet Roman infrastructure, Christianity, Latin language, and legal concepts continued shaping European societies. The transformation from imperial administration to successor kingdoms unfolded across generations. Rather than a sudden fall, the West experienced a political reconfiguration. The memory of Rome remained powerful, influencing later rulers who sought legitimacy by invoking Roman heritage. The concept of empire did not disappear, it evolved. AD 476 stands as a convenient marker, but it represents a transition within a longer process of transformation rather than a single decisive collapse. If the Western Roman Empire did not collapse in a single dramatic moment, then its end must be understood as the result of accumulated structural pressures rather than one decisive event. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus in AD 476 symbolized the conclusion of Western imperial rule, but the deeper causes lay in long-term imbalances that had gradually reduced the state's capacity to sustain itself. Among these factors, fiscal weakness stands out clearly. The Western provinces generated less reliable revenue than their Eastern counterparts, particularly after the loss of North Africa. Without its most productive grain and tax base, the Western government struggled to finance a standing army comparable to earlier centuries. Military power, which had once guaranteed cohesion, became increasingly dependent on negotiated alliances with federate groups. This arrangement provided short-term defense, but limited centralized control. The Eastern Empire, by contrast, retained stronger urban economies, more consistent tax collection, and strategic trade networks centered on the Eastern Mediterranean. These resources enabled Constantinople to maintain larger and more stable military forces. Geography also played a role. The eastern provinces possessed more defensible frontiers and benefited from established urban centers that could support administration and logistics. The West faced extended land borders along the Rhine and Danube and relied heavily on frontier stability that deteriorated during the 5th century. Migratory movements of various groups were not new phenomena, yet in the weakened Western context, they became harder to manage. Settlement agreements, once tools of integration, turned into pathways for autonomous regional authority when central enforcement declined. Political fragmentation compounded fiscal and military challenges. Repeated struggles among generals and court factions disrupted continuity. When leadership changed frequently, long-term planning diminished. The Western imperial court lacked the stable succession patterns and institutional resilience that had briefly emerged in earlier centuries. The concentration of authority in the emperor's office, once a source of decisive governance, became a liability when emperors were young, dependent, or overshadowed by military strongmen. The Eastern Empire also faced internal conflicts, yet its administrative apparatus and economic base proved more adaptable. Cultural transformation further shaped outcomes. Christianity, which had become integrated into imperial governance, provided ideological continuity across both halves of the empire. However, ecclesiastical organization was often more deeply rooted in the urbanized East, where theological and administrative networks reinforced cohesion. In the West, ruralization and territorial contraction limited comparable institutional density. Over time, regional kingdoms emerged not as destroyers of Roman civilization, but as successors that absorbed its elements selectively. By the late 5th century, the Western imperial state no longer possessed the fiscal strength, military cohesion, or centralized authority necessary to sustain imperial office. The Eastern Empire, with greater resources and strategic depth, endured. The divergence was not predetermined at the height of Roman power, yet structural imbalance gradually widened. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was therefore not a single failure but the culmination of cumulative strain, economic contraction, military dependency, political fragmentation, and geographic vulnerability. Rome's Western authority faded when these pressures aligned beyond its capacity to adjust. When considering the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, one lesson emerges with unusual clarity. Expansion and sustainability are not the same achievement. Rome mastered expansion. Over centuries, it built roads across continents, integrated diverse peoples under a shared legal framework, and maintained military superiority across vast frontiers. Yet the skills required to conquer territory differed from those required to preserve balance within it. At its height in AD 117, the empire governed an immense population and an enormous geographic area. The administrative system functioned, the army was disciplined, and trade connected distant provinces. But the very scale that symbolized strength also imposed permanent obligations. Each additional province required defense, governance, and financial support. Once expansion slowed, the empire could no longer rely on conquest to offset costs. It had to sustain itself through careful management alone. Rome's experience demonstrates that institutions matter more over time than individual leaders. Capable emperors such as Augustus, Trajan, Hadrian, and Diocletian stabilized the empire through reform and discipline. However, the system often depended heavily on the competence of a single ruler. When succession faltered or military loyalty shifted, the absence of clear constitutional safeguards magnified instability. The concentration of authority in one office allowed decisive action during crises, yet it also meant that weakness at the center reverberated throughout the empire. Scale intensified this effect. In smaller states, misrule might damage limited territory. In a vast empire, misalignment between leadership, military, and finance could destabilize entire regions. Another lesson lies in economic balance. Rome's prosperity during the Pax Romana rested on integrated trade networks, stable coinage, and predictable taxation. When fiscal strain grew through inflation, loss of revenue, or rising military expenditure, the system narrowed its margin for recovery. Economic health supported political stability, and political stability supported economic exchange. When that mutual reinforcement weakened, correction became increasingly difficult. The Western Empire's loss of North Africa illustrates how removal of a single major revenue source could shift structural equilibrium irreversibly. Cultural integration also shaped endurance. Rome's willingness to extend citizenship and incorporate local elites strengthened loyalty across diverse territories. Legal uniformity provided shared identity without erasing regional traditions. Yet cultural cohesion depended on confidence in central authority. When that authority fragmented, regional identities filled the vacuum. The Eastern Empire survived partly because its administrative and urban networks remained dense enough to absorb shocks. The West, facing demographic decline and territorial contraction, lacked equivalent resilience. The fall of the Western Roman Empire did not erase Roman influence. Law, language, urban planning, and Christianity continued to shape European development for centuries. This continuity suggests that decline in political structure does not necessarily mean disappearance of cultural legacy. Empires can transform rather than simply vanish. Rome's story, viewed in full, is not solely a narrative of collapse, but of adaptation, endurance, and eventual transformation. Its rise reveals the power of organization and integration. Its fall reveals the limits of scale without sustainable balance. At the height of its territorial expansion in AD 117, the Roman Empire appeared secure beyond precedent. Yet the paradox introduced at the beginning of this narrative becomes clearer in retrospect. The moment of maximum reach also marked the point at which further growth became impractical. Power, on such a scale, required constant coordination of military strength, economic resources, administrative competence, and political legitimacy. When all of these elements aligned, the empire flourished. When even one began to drift out of balance, strain multiplied across the system. The Roman experience suggests that size magnifies both strength and weakness. Ambition fueled Rome's rise. Military innovation, disciplined organization, and pragmatic diplomacy enabled a small city-state to dominate the Mediterranean world. Expansion brought wealth and prestige, reinforcing confidence in Roman institutions. Yet ambition also generated structural commitments. Every new frontier required defense. Every annexed territory demanded integration. Success created expectations of continued dominance. When expansion ceased, the empire entered a phase in which maintaining existing commitments required as much energy as earlier conquests. The cost of standing still equaled the cost of moving forward. Governance, at such scale, demanded long-term equilibrium. Rome's administrative reforms under Diocletian and Constantine reveal recognition that earlier systems could no longer manage growing complexity. Bureaucracy expanded, taxation became more systematic, and authority more formalized. These reforms stabilized the empire for a time, particularly in the East, yet reform itself introduced rigidity. The state became more centralized and more demanding of resources. Flexibility narrowed. In the West, where fiscal capacity and demographic resilience were weaker, this rigidity limited the ability to respond creatively to pressure. Political authority also illustrates the paradox of concentration. The imperial system provided clarity. One emperor embodied the state. This arrangement simplified command structures and reduced overt factional competition during stable periods. However, it made succession inherently fragile. When emperors were strong, the system functioned efficiently. When emperors were weak or contested, instability spread rapidly. The absence of institutionalized transfer of power meant that each transition carried risk over centuries. Repeated disruptions accumulated into systemic vulnerability. Rome's story does not suggest that expansion or ambition inevitably lead to collapse. The Eastern Empire endured for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the Western imperial office, demonstrating that adaptation could preserve continuity. What Rome reveals instead is the importance of balance. Military strength without fiscal stability cannot sustain empire. Administrative reach without local integration breeds resistance. Centralized authority without predictable succession invites conflict. At its peak, Rome contained the seeds of these tensions not because it was flawed beyond repair, but because scale itself imposes limits. The larger the system, the more precisely its components must align. The Roman Empire rose through integration and discipline. It declined in the West when integration weakened and discipline fractured under cumulative strain. The paradox remains quiet, but persistent. The structures that enable extraordinary growth also create extraordinary obligations. Whether any vast power can expand indefinitely without encountering such limits remains an open question. The rise and fall of the Roman Empire offers more than a historical sequence of battles, emperors, and dates. It provides a long-term study of how power is built, how it is maintained, and how it gradually changes under pressure. Rome did not fail because of a single invasion, a single emperor, or a single decision. It transformed over centuries through cumulative shifts in economics, governance, military structure, and identity. Its western half eventually lost the capacity to coordinate these elements at scale. Its eastern half adapted more successfully and endured. The difference was not destiny, it was structural resilience. One educational lesson that emerges clearly is the importance of institutional design. Systems that rely too heavily on individual strength may achieve rapid success, but they remain vulnerable to unpredictable transitions. Rome's imperial model allowed decisive leadership, yet it lacked a stable, universally accepted method of succession. When leadership aligned with institutional stability, the empire prospered. When succession became uncertain, instability multiplied. This pattern encourages reflection on the long-term value of durable institutions over short-term concentration of power. Another lesson concerns sustainability. Expansion can generate wealth and prestige, but it also multiplies obligations. Rome's peak in AD 117 symbolized extraordinary reach, yet each frontier required permanent defense, and each province demanded administrative oversight. Once territorial growth slowed, financial equilibrium became more difficult to maintain. The Western Empire, particularly after losing North Africa, could not generate sufficient revenue to sustain its commitments. Economic contraction weakened military capacity, and weakened military capacity accelerated territorial loss. Sustainability required balance between ambition and resources. Cultural integration also shaped endurance. Rome's extension of citizenship and incorporation of provincial elites fostered loyalty across diverse populations. Law and infrastructure connected distant communities. Even after political fragmentation in the West, Roman legal traditions, language, and religious structures continued influencing emerging kingdoms. The endurance of these elements suggests that political collapse does not erase cultural achievement. The legacy of Rome survived not because its empire lasted forever, but because its systems of law, governance, and identity proved adaptable. The fall of the Western Roman Empire did not mark the end of civilization, nor did it signal the disappearance of Roman influence. It marked the end of a particular political arrangement. What had once been unified authority became a network of successor states drawing from Roman foundations. In the East, continuity remained under emperors who still called themselves Roman. The story, therefore, is not solely one of decline. It is one of transformation shaped by scale, leadership, and structural limits. If the empire reached its greatest size in AD 117 and never expanded further, perhaps the deeper question is not why Rome fell, but how any vast system maintains equilibrium over generations. Can power expand indefinitely without creating obligations that eventually exceed its capacity to manage them?